The homeless-looking woman James Parker fed at his kitchen table turned out to be worth more than the entire state's farming industry combined. But on that rainy evening, all he saw was someone in need, with his own farm teetering on the edge of foreclosure and barely enough food to get through the week. He still shared what little he had with the rain-soaked stranger who claimed to have lost her wallet. There was something different about her, the way she marveled at the simplest things, how her eyes lit up at the taste of his mother's recipe for chicken soup. Little did James know that his simple act of kindness was about to change not just his life, but the very fate of his beloved family farm. But when her true identity emerges, will it destroy the genuine connection they've built? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. James Parker stood at the edge of his cornfield, watching the sunrise paint the morning sky in shades of amber and rose. The crisp autumn air carried the familiar scent of earth and growing things, a smell that had been part of his life for all of his 32 years. But today, that cherished scent was tinged with the bitter taste of worry. The letter from First National Bank lay crumpled in his pocket, its contents burning like a hot coal against his thigh. Third notice. Final warning. The words had blurred together as he'd read them yesterday, but their meaning was crystal clear. Pay up or lose everything. His calloused hand brushed against the rough bark of the old oak tree his grandfather had planted. The Parker family farm had passed down through 4 generations, each one adding their own chapter to its story. His father's words echoed in his mind, spoken from his deathbed just 18 months ago. "The land is our legacy, son. Take care of it, and it'll take care of you." But the truth was, the land hadn't been taking care of anyone lately. 3 years of drought, followed by a season of unexpected frost, had left their mark. The big agricultural corporations were squeezing out family farms like his, buying up land at rock-bottom prices and turning centuries of tradition into nothing more than numbers on a spreadsheet. Inside the farmhouse, he could hear his mother, Margaret, moving about the kitchen. The familiar clatter of pots and pans brought a sad smile to his face. She'd been his rock since Dad died, keeping their home running while he struggled to keep the farm afloat. At 68, she should be enjoying retirement, not worrying about mortgage payments and grain prices. James walked to the barn, each step heavy with purpose. The ancient structure creaked a greeting as he pushed open the heavy wooden doors. Inside, the morning light filtered through gaps in the weathered planks, creating dancing patterns on the dusty floor. Their remaining dairy cows, half of what they'd had 2 years ago, mooed softly in their stalls. "Morning, ladies," he murmured, beginning the familiar routine of feeding and milking. His hands moved automatically while his mind wandered to the stack of bills waiting in his office. The new tractor they desperately needed would have to wait another season. The irrigation system repairs would have to be patched together with spare parts and prayer. And somehow he needed to find $50,000 by the end of the month, or the bank would start foreclosure proceedings. The sound of tires on gravel drew his attention. Through the barn door, he watched Mr. Thompson's truck pull up. The sight of the local feed supplier made his stomach clench. Another bill he couldn't pay in full. "Morning, James," Thompson called out, climbing down from his truck. The older man's face was creased with concern. "Brought your delivery, and don't worry about the payment this time. We can work something out." James felt shame burn in his chest. "I appreciate it, Tom, but I can't keep accepting credit. It's not right." Thompson's weathered face softened. "Your daddy helped me out plenty when I was starting my business. Besides, you're one of the few honest farmers left in the county. We need folks like you to stick around." The kindness in the older man's voice made James's throat tight. He nodded, unable to speak for a moment. This was what he loved about their small farming community. People looked out for each other, but pride and gratitude warred in his chest. How long could he keep accepting help before it became charity? Back in the house, his mother was setting out breakfast. The kitchen was warm and bright, filled with the aroma of coffee and fresh-baked biscuits. She took one look at his face and pulled out an extra plate. "Tom Thompson staying for breakfast?" she asked, already knowing the answer. In their house, no one left hungry, no matter how tight things were. "Mom, we need to talk about selling some of the back acreage," James said quietly, watching her busy herself with the coffee pot. "Maybe even think about moving into town." Margaret. Parker's hands stilled. She turned to face him, her grey hair caught in the morning light. "This farm buried your father, your grandfather, and your great-grandfather. When my time comes, it'll bury me too. We're not going anywhere." The fierce determination in her voice matched the steel in her spine. James recognized that look. It was the same one she'd worn when Dad got sick, when the drought hit, when the bank started sending notices. It was the look that said Parker women didn't break and Parker men didn't quit. But as he sat down to his mother's breakfast, watching her serve Tom Thompson with the same grace she'd shown to every guest for 40 years, James wondered how much longer they could hold out. The world was changing, and family farms like theirs were becoming as rare as summer snow. Little did he know, change was about to arrive on his doorstep in the most unexpected way possible. Sarah Chen stared at her reflection in the sleek glass windows of Chen Technologies headquarters, barely recognizing the woman who stared back. Designer suit, perfectly styled hair, Louboutin heels that cost more than some people's monthly salary. She looked every bit the billionaire CEO the world expected her to be. And she had never felt more trapped. "Ms. Chen, the board is waiting." Her assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "They're expecting your decision on the agricultural automation initiative." Her hands clenched around the proposal on her desk. Another acquisition, another small business swallowed whole by her company's relentless expansion. The numbers made sense. They always did. But lately, every victory felt hollow. Every decision weighted with the knowledge of lives changed forever by the stroke of her pen. The boardroom doors loomed before her like the gates of a prison. Inside, 12 men and women in expensive suits sat waiting, their faces a mixture of anticipation and calculation. They'd been pushing for this deal for months, a revolutionary system that would make traditional farming obsolete, efficient, profitable, soulless. "Before we begin," one of the board members started, "the press is already—" Sarah didn't hear. The rest, something inside her, some last thread of resistance, finally snapped. Without a word, she turned and walked out, ignoring the startled calls behind her. Her heels clicked against marble floors as she strode through the lobby, past security guards who didn't dare stop her. The private elevator whisked her to the underground parking garage. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with her car keys, adrenaline coursing through her veins. The Ferrari roared to life, and she accelerated out of the garage, leaving behind the towering glass monument to her success. She drove without direction, watching the city's gleaming skyscrapers give way to suburbs, then to rolling countryside. Her phone buzzed incessantly. First her assistant, then board members, finally her younger sister, the only person who might understand. She turned it off and tossed it onto the passenger seat. The late afternoon sun painted the landscape in gold, and Sarah felt something inside her begin to unwind. When was the last time she'd watched a sunset? When had she last done anything that wasn't scheduled, calculated, strategized? The memories flooded back. Childhood summers spent at her grandmother's small house in rural China, helping in the vegetable garden, eating fruits picked straight from the trees. Before her father's tech company took off, before boarding schools and Ivy League universities, before she became the youngest female CEO of a Fortune 500 company. Lost in thought, she almost missed the warning light on her dashboard. The Ferrari's engine made an ominous sound, and the steering wheel began to vibrate. "No, no, no," she muttered, guiding the car onto the shoulder of the increasingly narrow country road. Steam billowed from under the hood as the car died. Sarah grabbed her phone, only to remember she'd turned it off. When she tried to restart, the screen remained black. dead battery. Her purse was gone, probably left behind in her hasty departure. A quick search of the car yielded nothing but an old water bottle and her company ID. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. In the distance, she could see farmland stretching to the horizon, peaceful and eternal. A few raindrops began to fall, quickly turning into a steady drizzle that plastered her expensive silk blouse to her skin. Sarah Chen, who controlled billions in assets and could make markets move with a single decision, stood on the side of a rural road in the rain, completely alone. And somehow, for the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe. Lightning flashed across the sky, followed by a loud crack of thunder. In the brief illumination, she spotted a farmhouse in the distance, warm light glowing from its windows. With no other options, she began walking, her designer heels sinking into the muddy earth with every step. The rain intensified, and Sarah couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of her situation. Her perfectly styled hair now hung in wet strands around her face, her makeup running in dark streaks down her cheeks. She probably looked homeless, a far cry from the polished business magazine covers she usually graced. As she approached the farmhouse, a dog began barking somewhere in the darkness. Sarah hesitated at the front gate, suddenly uncertain. In the city, her name opened every door. Out here, she was just a bedraggled stranger asking for help. The porch light flickered on, and she saw a tall figure step outside. In that moment, Sarah Chen, billionaire CEO of Chen Technologies, did something she hadn't done in years. She put her fate in someone else's hands. The old screen door creaked open as James stepped onto the porch, squinting through the rain. The figure at his gate looked like a drowned cat, expensive clothes plastered to her body, dark hair hanging in wet ropes around her face. Something about her stance, simultaneously defeated and determined, made him reach for the porch light. "Hello?" he called out. "You all right out there?" The woman took a hesitant step forward. "I'm so sorry to bother you. My car broke down a few miles back and my phone's dead. I don't suppose I could use your phone to call for help." Her accent was cultured, city-bred, but there was something vulnerable in her voice that struck a chord. James's mother appeared, behind him, drying her hands on her apron. "James Parker, you bring that poor soul in out of the rain this instant." Minutes later, Sarah sat at their worn kitchen table, wrapped in one of Margaret's old quilts, her teeth chattering slightly. Steam rose from the bowl of chicken soup in front of her, and the aroma made her stomach growl embarrassingly loud. "Eat up, dear," Margaret urged, placing a plate of homemade biscuits beside the soup. "Nothing warms you up like chicken soup on a rainy night." Sarah lifted the spoon to her lips, and her eyes widened at the first taste. "This is amazing," she breathed, taking another spoonful. "I've never had chicken soup like this before." "Family recipe," Margaret said proudly. "Been passing it down through the Parker women for generations." She shot a meaningful look at James, who was trying not to stare at their beautiful guest. "I tried calling the mechanic," James said, returning from the living room. "But Bill's not picking up. Storm's probably knocked out some lines. You're welcome to stay until morning, Miss Sarah," she said quickly. "Just Sarah, and I couldn't impose." "Nonsense," Margaret interrupted. "That spare room's going to waste, and I won't hear of anyone driving out in this weather. James, go fetch some towels and something dry for her to wear." Alone with Margaret, Sarah found herself relaxing. The kitchen was nothing like the sterile modern space in her penthouse apartment. Here, copper pots hung from ceiling hooks, family. Photos crowded the walls, and everything smelled of fresh bread and coffee. "You're not from around here," Margaret observed, refilling Sarah's soup bowl without asking. "No, I'm from—" Sarah hesitated. "The city. I was just driving, trying to clear my head, and then everything went wrong at once." Margaret's knowing eyes studied her face. "Sometimes things have to go wrong before they can go right," James returned, with a stack of towels and what looked like women's clothing. "These were my sister's," he explained. "She left some things when she moved to California. Bathrooms down the hall if you want to change." The clothes were simple, worn jeans and a faded flannel shirt, but they were warm and dry. Sarah emerged from the bathroom, feeling like a different person, her expensive outfit dripping on the shower rod. When she returned to the kitchen, James was at the table with his own bowl of soup, jacket discarded and sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms. He looked up as she entered, and something flickered in his eyes. "Those suit you better than they ever suited Jenny," Margaret declared. "Now sit down and have some more soup. You're too skinny by half." The conversation flowed easily as they ate. Sarah found herself talking about her grandmother's garden in China, surprised by how the memory still brought tears to her eyes. James spoke about the challenges of keeping the farm running, his voice warm with passion despite the obvious strain. "It's not just about making money," he explained, breaking a biscuit in half. "It's about preserving something real, something that matters." Sarah felt a knot form in her throat. How many small farms had her company's automation initiative threatened? How many families like the Parkers would be forced to sell if it went through? Later, as Margaret showed her to the spare room, Sarah found herself lingering in the hallway, studying the family photos. Young James on a tractor with his father, Margaret in her younger days holding up a prize-winning pie. A family portrait where everyone wore matching flannel shirts and genuine smiles. "Breakfast is at 6, Margaret called out. "James could use an extra hand with the morning chores if you're interested." Sarah turned, surprised. "I've never done farm work before. First time for everything, dear." Margaret's eyes twinkled. "Besides, looks to me like you could use a day of honest work to clear your head." That night, lying in the narrow bed under a handmade quilt, Sarah listened to the rain drumming on the roof. The room smelled of lavender and fresh laundry, and, somewhere in the distance, she could hear a cow lowing softly. For the first time in years, she didn't reach for her phone to check emails or stock prices. Instead, she found herself wondering what it would be like to wake up to this peace every morning, to work with her hands, to create something real. Little did she know tomorrow would change everything, for her, for James, and for the future of Parker Family Farm. The rooster's crow startled Sarah awake at dawn. For a moment she lay disoriented in the unfamiliar bed, watching dust motes dance in the early morning light. Then she remembered the rain, the farm, the kindness of strangers. A soft knock at her door was followed by Margaret's voice. "Breakfast in 15 minutes, dear. There's fresh coffee if you're up for it." Sarah found her city clothes still damp, so she pulled on the borrowed jeans and flannel shirt again. Her reflection in the old mirror was almost unrecognizable. No makeup, hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, designer labels replaced by worn denim. Somehow, she looked younger, more like the girl she used to be before boardrooms and billion-dollar deals consumed her life. The kitchen was alive with morning activity. Margaret worked the stove like a conductor, orchestrating a symphony of bacon, eggs, and fresh biscuits. James sat at the table, studying what looked like financial papers, his forehead creased with worry. He quickly tucked them away when he saw her. "Sleep well?" he asked, pushing a mug of coffee toward her. It was simple ceramic, chipped at the rim, but the coffee smelled better than anything from her expensive espresso machine. "Better than I have in years," Sarah admitted, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "That offer to help with chores." "Still stand?" James raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that? Farm work isn't exactly—" He gestured at her manicured hands. "Try me," Sarah challenged, surprising herself with her eagerness. The next few hours were a revelation. James led her to the barn, explaining each task with patience. She learned to milk cows, albeit clumsily at first, her corporate-trained mind fascinated by the ancient rhythm of the work. The cows seemed to sense her nervousness, but one gentle Jersey named Buttercup suffered her inexperienced hands with remarkable patience. "You're a natural," James commented, watching her successfully fill a bucket. "Most city folks give up." After the first try, Sarah felt an unfamiliar warmth at his praise. I had a good teacher, though I have to admit, this is about as far from my usual morning routine as you can get. What do you do? James asked, helping her carry the heavy milk containers. In the city, I mean? Sarah's heart skipped a beat. I work in technology, she said carefully. Office job, nothing interesting. They moved on to feeding the chickens, checking the vegetable garden, and repairing a section of fence damaged in last night's storm. Sarah's muscles burned with unfamiliar effort, but she found herself enjoying every minute. James worked steadily beside her, his movements efficient and practiced, occasionally offering quiet guidance or an encouraging word. The land tells you what it needs, he explained, as they walked the fields later that morning. You just have to learn to listen. Sarah looked out over the endless rows of corn, the distant pastures where cattle grazed. She thought about the automation initiative sitting on her desk back in the city, with its cold calculations and projected efficiencies. How could algorithms possibly capture this? The morning mist rising off the fields, the smell of earth after rain, the delicate balance of nature and nurture in the vegetable garden. Margaret taught her how to identify ripe tomatoes and showed her the proper way to harvest lettuce. The trick is to be gentle, the older woman demonstrated. Everything growing has a life of its own, deserves respect. By midday, Sarah's designer shoes, which Margaret had kindly tried to clean, were beyond salvation. Her hands were dirty and her back ached. But she felt more alive than she had in years. During lunch, she found herself laughing at James's stories about escaped pigs and stubborn goats, sharing memories of her grandmother's garden, feeling something tight in her chest slowly begin to unwind. The afternoon brought new lessons. James showed her how to operate the ancient tractor, explaining the temperamental gears with the same patience he might use with a child. When she successfully drove it in a straight line across the field, his proud smile made her chest tighten. In an unexpected way. Most folks don't understand what farming really is, he said as they walked back to the house at sunset. They think it's just planting seeds and waiting. But it's more than that. It's being a mechanic, a veterinarian, a meteorologist, and a businessman all at once. He trailed off, looking embarrassed. It's creating something real, Sarah finished softly, remembering his words from the night before. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Sarah felt her breath catch. In the golden light of sunset, his eyes were the exact color of rich earth after rain. The moment was broken by Margaret's call for dinner, but as they walked back to the farmhouse, Sarah felt something shifting inside her. The urgent emails waiting in her office, the board members demanding decisions, the endless cycle of meetings and mergers. It all seemed increasingly distant, like a half-remembered dream. What she didn't notice was Margaret watching from the kitchen window, a knowing smile on her face as she observed the two young people walking side by side there, shadows stretching long in the evening light. Sarah sat at the kitchen table late that evening, a cup of tea growing cold beside her as she studied the farm's ledger. James had left it out accidentally, and while she knew she shouldn't pry, her trained eye couldn't help but spot the patterns in the numbers and the problems they revealed. The farm's struggles were worse than James had admitted. The interest rates on their loans were predatory, their supply chain was inefficient, and their pricing strategy for crops needed serious revision. With her phone still dead, she couldn't access her usual resources, but years of business experience had taught her to see opportunities others might miss. Still up? James's voice startled her. He stood in the doorway looking tired after a long day in the fields. Sorry, she said quickly, closing the ledger. I couldn't sleep, and I have some experience with bookkeeping. Your numbers are solid, but your bank is taking advantage of you. James's face tightened. The big banks don't care much for small farms these days. Have you considered agricultural cooperatives? Sarah asked, before she could stop herself. Small farms can band together for better lending terms, shared equipment costs, collective bargaining power. She caught herself. seeing James's surprised look. "That's actually a really good idea," he said slowly. "But how do you know so much about agricultural finance?" Sarah's heart raced. "I worked with some farming clients in my office job." The next morning, Sarah made a careful phone call from the landline while everyone else was out. Using a colleague's name, she contacted an agricultural cooperative she knew of through her company's research. By the time James came in for lunch, she had information about better loan terms and a possible partnership with other local farms. "I made some calls," she said casually, spreading the materials on the table. "The cooperative is looking to expand in this area. They could offer you half your current interest rate plus better prices for your crops through collective negotiation." James studied the papers, his expression a mixture of hope and suspicion. "This looks almost too good to be true. Why would they be interested in a struggling farm like ours?" "Because you have something they need," Sarah explained, falling into her familiar role of strategic advisor. "Your location is perfect for their distribution network, and your organic farming practices are exactly what the market wants right now. Plus, your soil quality reports from last year show exceptional results." "How did you know about our soil reports?" Sarah froze. "I saw them in the office earlier." She recovered quickly. "The point is, you have more leverage than you realize. Small farms working together can compete with big agriculture, but you need the right structure and partnerships." Over the next few days, Sarah carefully wove her business knowledge into casual suggestions. She showed James how to renegotiate with suppliers, introduced modern inventory management techniques, and quietly used her understanding of market trends to help him plan next season's crops. Meanwhile, her own phone remained hidden in her room, now charged but turned off. Each night she thought about turning it on, facing the hundreds of missed calls and emails. But each morning brought new projects at the farm, more opportunities to help, and increasingly frequent moments when James would look at her with something more than gratitude in his eyes. One afternoon, while helping Margaret in the kitchen, Sarah noticed a familiar magazine on the counter, hastily shoved under. A cookbook. Her own face stared up from the cover, captured in a power pose beneath the headline, "Tech's Youngest Female Billionaire." Her heart stopped. "Found that this morning," Margaret said quietly, not turning from her baking. "You know, when my James looks at you, he's not seeing a CEO or a billionaire. He's seeing the girl who gets up at dawn to help with chores, who laughs at his bad jokes, who cares about this farm almost as much as he does." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I never meant to deceive anyone. It's just, for the first time in my life, someone was seeing me, not my bank account or my company." Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and turned to face Sarah. "Life has a way of bringing us where we need to be, even if we don't know why at first. But secrets have a way of coming out, dear. And the longer you wait, the harder it gets." "I'll tell him," Sarah promised. "I just need to figure out how." But fate had other plans. That evening, as they all sat down to dinner, a breaking news alert flashed on the small TV in the corner of the kitchen. James reached for the remote to turn it off as usual, but not before Sarah's corporate headshot filled the screen, accompanied by the words, "Tech CEO missing." The silence that followed was deafening. The morning after the news broadcast, the Parker farm saw more visitors than it had in years. First came Betty from the general store, ostensibly to deliver a catalogue that could have easily waited. Her eyes darted around the kitchen, disappointment evident when she found only Margaret kneading bread dough. "Heard you had some company staying," Betty said, trying to sound casual. "City girl, they're saying down at the diner." "Just helping out for a few days," Margaret replied serenely, neither confirming nor denying the rumors now circulating through their small town. Out in the barn, James and Sarah worked in tense silence. The news broadcast hung between them like a storm cloud, though James hadn't said a word about it. Sarah had tried to explain last night, but he'd simply walked out of the kitchen, leaving her alone with Margaret's sympathetic gaze. The cooperative called. James finally said, his voice carefully neutral. "They're sending someone out today to discuss the partnership." Sarah nodded, fighting the urge to tell him she'd pulled strings to expedite the meeting. Instead, she focused on feeding the chickens, an activity that had become surprisingly therapeutic over the past few days. By mid-morning, more locals had found excuses to drive past the farm. Pastor Mike's car crawled by so slowly it nearly stalled. The Henderson twins rode their bikes past 3 times, craning their necks toward the fields where James was working. Sarah watched it all from the barn, feeling like a circus attraction. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd traded the fishbowl of corporate life for an even smaller one. Tom Thompson arrived around noon, carrying not just feed supplies, but also a pie his wife had just happened to bake. His eyes widened when he saw Sarah in her work clothes, helping James repair the tractor. "Well now," he said, looking between them. "Heard we had some excitement out here at Parker Farm." Before either could respond, 3 more trucks pulled into the drive. The cooperative representatives had arrived, but word had clearly spread. Half the local farming community seemed to have tagged along. Sarah watched James straighten his shoulders, preparing to face the crowd. Without thinking, she stepped up beside him, her hand brushing his arm. To her surprise, he didn't pull away. The meeting that followed would be talked about in town for years to come. Sarah, unable to hide her expertise any longer, took charge when the cooperative representatives began their standard pitch. She countered their initial offer with detailed market analysis, cited current agricultural futures, and negotiated terms that had the visiting farmers frantically taking notes. "Where did you learn to talk like that?" old Frank Miller demanded, voicing what everyone was thinking. Sarah glanced at James, then took a deep breath. "I should have been honest from the start. I'm Sarah Chen, CEO of Chen Technologies." The crowd murmured, but she pressed on. "But that's not why I care about making this deal work. I care because in the past week I've learned more about real value and honest work than in all my years in corporate boardrooms." A heavy silence followed her words. Then Tom Thompson let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned. James Parker, you've got a billionaire fixing your tractor." The tension broke as several people chuckled. Soon, the gathering turned into an impromptu community meeting. Farmers who'd been competing for generations began discussing cooperation. Sarah found herself drawing diagrams in the dirt, explaining how small farms could leverage their collective strength. As the sun began to set, Margaret appeared with pitchers of lemonade and her famous cornbread. The mood had shifted from suspicious to cautiously optimistic. Even Pastor Mike was nodding thoughtfully as Sarah explained how local farms could create their own distribution network. But through it all, James remained quiet. He participated in the discussions, asked relevant questions, but his eyes kept returning to Sarah with an expression she couldn't read. Later, after everyone had gone, and the dust had settled on the drive, Sarah found him sitting on the porch steps. The evening air was heavy with the scent of coming rain. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you," she said softly, sitting beside him but careful not to touch. "I was going to. But then, every day here felt more real than my entire life before. And I was afraid of losing that." James stared out at his fields, silvered by the rising moon. "You know what's funny?" he finally said. "I keep thinking about something my dad used to say. Good earth knows good people. He meant you can't fool the land. It knows if you're working it with honest intentions." He turned to look at her. "The thing is, I've never seen the farm respond to anyone the way it does to you." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "What happens now?" Before James could answer, a car appeared on the road, its headlights cutting through the dusk. As it drew closer, Sarah recognized the sleek corporate vehicle. Her past had finally caught up with her. The corporate car idled at the end of the driveway for what felt like an eternity before turning around and disappearing into the night. Sarah released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Beside her, James remained silent, his shoulder warm against hers on the narrow porch step. "They'll be back," she said quietly. "My company. They don't give up easily." "Is that where you learned it?" James asked, and there was something different in his voice. That stubbornness that made you stick with morning chores even when your hands were blistered? Sarah laughed softly, looking down at her palms. The once manicured hands now bore calluses and scratches, badges of honor from days of honest work. "Maybe I was always stubborn. I just needed the right reason to show it." The crickets chirped in the darkness, a symphony accompanied by the distant lowing of cattle. Inside, they could hear Margaret puttering in the kitchen, the familiar clatter of dishes providing a homey soundtrack to the evening. "Walk with me?" James stood suddenly, offering his hand. Sarah took it, noting how naturally their fingers intertwined, how right it felt despite everything that should have made it wrong. They walked in comfortable silence through the fields, the moon casting long shadows across the corn rows. The night air was thick with the sweet smell of late summer, and fireflies danced around them like scattered stars. "You know what I thought when I first saw you," James said as they reached the old oak tree, standing there in the rain in those fancy clothes, looking like a lost princess. He turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "I thought, here's someone who needs more than just a phone and a dry place to sleep. Here's someone looking for something real." Sarah's heart thundered in her chest. I am." She stepped closer, drawn by something stronger than gravity. "James, everything in my life before this was just numbers on a screen, success measured in stock, prices and market shares. But here," she gestured at the farm around them, "here I found something authentic, something that matters. And now," his voice was rough with emotion, "now that your worlds are colliding, your company car just drove up to my dirt road, Sarah. Tomorrow, there'll probably be reporters, corporate, lawyers, your whole billion-dollar life coming to claim you back. I don't want to go back," she whispered. But what she wanted got lost as James closed the distance between them, his hands cupping her face with infinite tenderness. When his lips met hers, it was nothing like the polished kisses she'd shared with corporate executives and society's elite. This was raw, real, tasting of sunshine and honest work and possibility. Sarah melted into him, her fingers gripping his worn shirt, anchoring herself to this moment, this man, this life that had crept into her heart when she wasn't looking. The kiss deepened, speaking of things too profound for words, of shared dawns and simple meals, of dreams bigger than bank accounts, of a future neither of them had imagined possible a week ago. When they finally parted, breathless and trembling, James rested his forehead against hers. "I don't care how many zeros are in your bank account," he murmured. "I just care about who you are when you're here, covered in dirt and arguing with my stubborn old tractor." Sarah laughed, even as tears spilled down her cheeks. "That's the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me." A loud crackle of thunder made them jump apart. Storm clouds had rolled in unnoticed, blotting out the moon. As the first heavy drops began to fall, they ran back toward the farmhouse, hand in hand, laughing like teenagers. They reached the porch just as the sky opened up. Sarah's borrowed clothes were soaked again, but this time she didn't feel lost or alone. This time she felt found. Margaret was waiting at the door with towels, a knowing smile on her face. "About time," she muttered, shooing them inside. "I was beginning to think you two would need divine intervention." In the warm light of the kitchen, Sarah caught her reflection in the window. Her hair was wild, her cheeks flushed, her eyes bright with joy. She looked nothing like the polished CEO from the magazine covers, and yet she had never felt more herself. James came up behind her, wrapping her in a fresh towel and his arms. "Stay," he whispered against her hair. "Whatever storms are coming, we'll weather them together." Sarah turned in his embrace, her heart full of a feeling too big for words, but before she could respond, a flash of red and blue lights illuminated the kitchen. Through the rain-streaked window, they could see police cars pulling into the driveway. The storm had arrived sooner than expected. The police officers who stepped into the Parker farmhouse kitchen weren't alone. Behind them came a tall man in an expensive suit, his designer shoes incongruous on the worn wooden floor. Sarah's breath caught. Michael Jang, her company's head of security. "Ms. Chen," he said formally, "the board has been extremely concerned about your absence." His eyes took in her wet clothes, James's protective stance beside her, the homey kitchen with its mismatched chairs and copper pots. "There were fears you might have been kidnapped. As you can see, I'm fine," Sarah replied, unconsciously straightening her spine, CEO authority seeping back into her voice. "There's no need for law enforcement involvement." The local sheriff, Bill Matthews, looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, when a person of your prominence goes missing, certain protocols—" "Person of your prominence?" James interrupted, his voice tight. He turned to Sarah. "Just how important are you?" Michael answered before Sarah could. "Ms. Chen is the CEO and majority shareholder of Chen Technologies. Current net worth approximately $12 billion. The company's stock has dropped 15% since her disappearance, affecting thousands of employees and shareholders." The kitchen fell silent, except for Margaret's sharp intake of breath. Sarah watched the color drain from James's face as the numbers sank in. $12 billion, he whispered. "You're worth $12 billion? James, please." Sarah reached for him, but he stepped back. All those suggestions about the farm, the cooperative, the business advice. His voice grew harder with each question. Was this some kind of experiment? Rich CEO playing farmer for a week? "No!" Sarah's protest was fierce. "Everything I felt here, everything I feel for you, it's a real..." James laughed bitterly. "You own a tech empire that's actively working to eliminate family farms like mine. How's that for real?" Sarah felt like she'd been slapped. "What are you talking about?" "The Agricultural Automation Initiative," James spat. "Your company's big project to replace traditional farming with AI and robots. Tom Thompson showed me the articles yesterday. I didn't want to believe it was your company, but..." He gestured at Michael. "Guess I can't deny it now." Margaret stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "James, let her explain." But Sarah's world was spinning. The automation initiative, the very project she'd run away from, the decision she couldn't bring herself to make. Now it stood between her and everything she'd grown to love. "The board expects you back immediately," Michael was saying. "There's a car waiting. Our PR team has prepared a statement about your need for a brief personal retreat." "No!" The word came out stronger than Sarah expected. Michael blinked. "I'm sorry? I said no." Sarah moved to stand beside James, even as he stiffened at her proximity. "I'm not going back. Not yet. And that automation initiative, it's done. Cancel it." "Ms. Chen, you can't just..." "I own controlling interest in the company," Sarah cut him off. "I can do exactly that." She turned to James, willing him to meet her eyes. "I didn't come here to study small farms or gather data. I ran away because I couldn't bear to be part of destroying something precious. Then I found this place, found you, and understood exactly what I'd been fighting to protect. A billion-dollar decision based on a week's romance?" Michael's voice dripped skepticism. "The board will fight you on this." "Let them try." Sarah's voice was steel. "I've spent my life building technology to make the world better, not to replace its heart with circuits and code." She stepped closer. To James, "Your father was right. The land knows good people. It also knows its true guardians. And I choose to guard it with you, if you'll let me." James finally looked at her, really looked at her. She could see the hurt warring with hope in his eyes. "How can I believe you? How can I trust that this isn't just another corporate game?" Sarah's answer was interrupted by Margaret's sharp voice. James Parker, that girl has spent the past week mucking out stalls and learning to milk cows when she could have been in a five-star hotel. She's earned calluses alongside you and fought for this farm's future. If that's a game, it's the most honest one I've ever seen. The sheriff cleared his throat. Well, since there's clearly no kidnapping. He nodded awkwardly and retreated, taking his deputies with him. Michael remained, his expression torn between exasperation and resignation. Ms. Chen, at least come back to handle this properly. Make your announcements through official channels. Sarah looked around the kitchen, at the familiar walls that had witnessed so many family moments, at Margaret's worried face, at James's conflicted expression. One way or another, everything would change tonight. "Give me 3 days," she said finally. 3 days to prove this is more than a rich woman's whim. 3 days to show you, James, that what we have is worth fighting for. The silence that followed seemed to last an eternity. Then James spoke, his voice rough with emotion. 3 days, he agreed, but this time no more secrets. The morning headlines screamed across every major news outlet. Tech billionaire found on farm. Chen Technologies CEO's rural romance. Silicon Valley princess turns farmhand. Sarah scrolled through them on her newly reactivated phone, sitting at the familiar kitchen table, while Margaret stress-baked enough pies to feed the entire county. James hadn't spoken to her since last night's confrontation. He'd retreated to the fields before dawn, the distant rumble of the tractor a reminder of the gulf between their worlds. "Your company's stock is still falling," Michael reported grimly from the corner where he'd set up an impromptu office. He'd refused to leave, claiming responsibility for her safety. "The board is calling for an emergency meeting. They're talking about a vote of no confidence." Sarah set down her phone. "Let them meet. I'm not backing down on this." Her own inbox was flooded with messages from board members, shareholders, and reporters. Among them was an email from Winston Garcia, her biggest competitor, offering to rescue her company from what he called her rural breakdown. The landline rang, the 4th time that hour. Margaret answered it, then quickly hung up. "Another reporter," she sighed. "They've started calling everyone in town." Through the window, Sarah could see unfamiliar cars driving slowly past the farm. Some had news logos on their sides, others were probably paparazzi. The peaceful sanctuary of the past week was crumbling. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister. "Are you crazy? Dad built this company from nothing. You can't throw it all away for some farmer." But her father had also taught her something else, something she'd forgotten until this week. "Build things that matter, Sarah, not just things that make money." The screen door creaked, and James walked in, his face unreadable. Without a word, he dropped a newspaper on the table. The headline made Sarah's heart sink. Chen Technologies' agricultural initiative would revolutionize farming industry. "Your company's press release from last week," he said quietly, "still want to claim you're protecting small farms." Before Sarah could respond, Michael's phone chimed. His face went pale. "The board. They're not waiting for a meeting. They've filed for an emergency injunction to prevent you from canceling the automation initiative. They're claiming temporary mental incapacity due to stress." Sarah stood up so abruptly her chair toppled backward. "Mental incapacity, because I choose to see the human cost of our technology, because you disappeared for a week and now want to cancel a billion-dollar project over a—" Michael glanced at James' personal matter. The room grew thick with tension. Then Margaret spoke up, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Seems to me sometimes you need to step away from something to see it clearly." James turned to Sarah, his expression softening slightly. "Is that what happened? You saw something here that changed your mind?" "I saw everything," Sarah whispered. "I saw how algorithms can't measure the value of generations working the same land. How efficiency reports don't account for the way you know every animal by name. How profit margins don't reflect the real cost of losing places like this." She reached for her phone, fingers flying over the screen. "I'm calling an emergency press conference right here on the farm. It's time to show the world what we're really fighting for." "Sarah," Michael warned, Think about what you're doing. I am. She looked around the kitchen at the life she'd glimpsed here. For the first time in years, I really am. But as she moved to start making calls, James caught her arm. The bank called this morning, he said heavily. They're foreclosing on the farm. All this corporate drama. It doesn't change the fact that we can't make the payment due next week. Sarah felt her world tilt. In fighting for the bigger picture, she'd almost forgotten the immediate crisis facing the farm, the very reason she'd started helping in the first place. She had 3 days to save both her company and the farm, and right now she wasn't sure she could save either. The makeshift boardroom in the Parker's barn was possibly the strangest corporate setting in Chen Technologies' history. Sarah had insisted on hosting the video conference from the farm, and now she sat at a weathered workbench, her laptop propped on old feed sacks, while board members' faces glared at her from the screen. "This is unprecedented," Bernard Walsh, the lead director, was saying. "Our stock has dropped 20%. Partners are backing out, all because our CEO decided to play farm wife for a week." "I didn't play anything," Sarah's voice was sharp. "I learned something crucial about our market, our impact, and our responsibility. By milking cows," another director scoffed, "by seeing firsthand what our automation initiative would destroy." Sarah leaned forward, her borrowed flannel shirt a stark contrast to the suits on screen. "We're approaching this all wrong. Instead of replacing traditional farming, we should be empowering it." Through the barn door, she could see James talking to a group of local farmers who'd gathered in support. The story had spread, and the agricultural community was watching closely. "The board has a responsibility to our shareholders," Bernard continued. "The automation initiative has been in development for 2 years. The projected returns are meaningless if we destroy the agricultural backbone of this country." Sarah pulled up a document on her screen. "I've spent all morning working on an alternative, a partnership program, using our tech to support small farms, not replace them." "Impossible to scale," someone argued. "Actually," Sarah countered, "I've run the numbers. By partnering with farming cooperatives like the one here, we could create a network of sustainable, tech-enhanced family farms. Lower overhead, better community buy-in, positive PR." A new face appeared on screen, Winston Garcia, her competitor. "The board has asked me to present an alternative. Chen Technologies doesn't need to waste time coddling small farms. I'm prepared to make an offer for the company at a premium to the current share price." Sarah felt her blood run cold, a hostile takeover. That's what they'd been planning while she was busy defending her vision. Through the barn window, she caught sight of Margaret, crossing the yard with a basket of fresh bread, distributing it among the waiting farmers. The scene struck her with sudden clarity. "Before you vote," Sarah said, her voice carrying new authority, "remember that I still own controlling interest. I can't stop you from filing injunctions or making takeover offers, but I can promise you this. If you try to force this automation initiative through, I'll sell my shares." The board erupted in chaos. "You wouldn't," Bernard gasped. "I would, but not to Winston." Sarah smiled. "I'll sell to the farming cooperatives. Break up the shares among thousands of small farmers. Let them decide how their food should be grown." The threat hung in the air. Sarah held her breath, watching the faces on screen cycle through shock, anger, and finally, consideration. "You really believe in this?" Bernard said slowly. "It wasn't a question. Enough to bet my entire inheritance on it." Sarah glanced out at James, who was now watching her through the barn door. "Some things are worth more than money. The shareholders won't like it," Winston warned. "Actually," Sarah pulled up another document, "I had my team run a survey. Public sentiment is overwhelmingly in favor of supporting small farms. Consumers want food grown by farmers, not robots. Our stock is down now, but backing local agriculture? That's not just good ethics, it's good business." The debate raged for another hour, but Sarah could feel the tide turning. By the time the call ended, she had provisional support for her partnership program, pending a detailed proposal. But as she closed her laptop, the weight of reality settled back in. She might have won the corporate battle, but the bank wouldn't. Wait for partnership programs to be approved. The farm's foreclosure deadline was still looming. James appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Heard you threatening to give up billions for farms like mine." "Not give up," Sarah corrected softly. "Invest in what matters." He took a step closer. "That's a big gamble." "No," she smiled, thinking of dawn chores and shared meals and the way he taught her to listen to the land. "It's the surest bet I've ever made." The community hall had never seen such a crowd. Local farmers filled every chair, reporters lined the walls, and a bank of cameras live-streamed the event to Chen Technologies shareholders worldwide. Sarah stood at the podium, wearing her usual corporate attire but with mud-spattered boots underneath, a bridge between two worlds. "For generations, we've treated farming as a problem to be solved," she began, her voice steady. "We've tried to replace human wisdom with artificial intelligence, centuries of tradition with automation. Today, I'm proposing something different, a partnership between technology and tradition." The screens behind her lit up with images of the Parker farm. "This is where I learned what real innovation looks like. It's not about replacing farmers, it's about empowering them." She outlined her vision. The Parker Farm would become the first agricultural education and innovation center, combining traditional farming methods with sustainable technology. Local farmers would teach alongside tech experts, creating a new model of agricultural education. "Imagine young farmers learning both ancient wisdom and cutting-edge techniques," Sarah continued. "Imagine technology serving the land instead of replacing it. This center will be the first of many, creating a network of knowledge sharing that preserves family farms while embracing the future." In the front row, James sat between his mother and Tom Thompson. His face remained carefully neutral, but his eyes never left Sarah's. Chen Technologies will provide the infrastructure and technology. The farming community will provide the expertise and soul. Together we'll create something unprecedented, a true bridge between Silicon Valley and the heartland. The room stirred with whispers as Sarah revealed the numbers: projected enrollment figures, sustainability metrics, revenue streams that would keep family farms profitable while advancing agricultural science. "This isn't charity," she emphasized. "It's innovation, real innovation, born from understanding what truly matters in agriculture. And it starts here, with one farm that reminded a lost CEO what real value looks like." As she concluded, the room erupted in a mix of applause and urgent questions. But Sarah's eyes found James, seeing in his face the first glimmer of hope since her identity had been revealed. The bank representative sat stiffly in the Parkers' living room, looking out of place among the worn furniture and family photos. Outside, dozens of local farmers had gathered, their trucks lining the dusty driveway in a show of solidarity. "Miss Chen," the lead banker said, checking his watch, "while your proposal is interesting, we have procedures to follow. The foreclosure notice can be resolved right now," Sarah interrupted, placing a certified check on the coffee table. "That covers the outstanding mortgage plus penalties." James started to protest, but Sarah held up her hand. "It's not a gift. It's an investment in our future agricultural education center. The farm will repay every cent through the program revenue." The banker picked up the check, frowning. Even with this payment, the long-term viability. He was cut off by a commotion. Outside, Tom Thompson burst through the door, waving a stack of papers. "Got every signature. Every farm in the county's committed to the education program." Behind him came a stream of farmers, each carrying enrollment pledges from their children and grandchildren. Margaret wiped tears from her eyes as she read the names. Generations of farming families ready to embrace a new future while preserving their heritage. "My company's board has approved initial funding," Sarah added, her voice firm. "But more importantly, these farmers have approved something more valuable, their trust and participation. The bankers huddled together, whispering urgently. Meanwhile, James stepped close to Sarah. "You're really doing this? Betting your whole company's future on us?" Sarah took his hand, not caring who saw. "No, I'm betting on what we can build together." The lead banker cleared his throat. "Given the unusual circumstances and the apparent community support, we're willing to convert the existing mortgage into a business loan for the education center." A cheer went up from the gathered crowd. Tom Thompson slapped James on the back, and Margaret hugged Sarah tight enough to crack ribs. But one voice cut through the celebration. "It won't work." Everyone turned to see Winston Garcia standing in the doorway, flanked by his own executives. "The board may have approved this little experiment, Sarah, but your shareholders haven't. I'm calling for a vote tomorrow morning. My offer for the company still stands." Sarah felt James tense beside her, but she squeezed his hand and stepped forward. "Perfect timing, Winston. I'd like you to meet my new shareholders." She nodded to Tom Thompson, who started handing out papers to the gathered farmers. "While you were plotting your takeover, I've been distributing part of my controlling interest to the farming cooperative. These families now own a stake in Chen Technologies, and tomorrow they'll vote to protect their investment in sustainable agriculture." Winston's face turned red as he realized his hostile takeover had just been blocked by the very farmers he'd hoped to replace with machines. "You can't run a tech company like a farm," he sputtered. "Actually," James spoke up, his voice carrying across the room, "I think she just proved you can run it better that way." The autumn morning painted the farm in shades of gold as Sarah walked the newly marked paths of the Agricultural Education Center. Construction crews were setting up the first classroom building, carefully positioned to preserve the historic barn. Students would arrive next month, a mix of young farmers and tech enthusiasts, all eager to learn this new fusion of tradition and innovation. The shareholders' vote had been unanimous. Even Winston had finally conceded, grudgingly admitting that Sarah's vision had captured the public's imagination. Chen Technologies' stock was reaching new highs as sustainable agriculture became the next big trend in tech investment. But it was the smaller changes that touched Sarah's heart most deeply. The way local farmers now gathered in the barn to share their knowledge, their pride restored. The sparkle in Margaret's eyes as she prepared to teach traditional food preservation alongside modern techniques. The renewed energy in the community as young people saw a future in their family farms. "Quite a change from when you first showed up in the rain." James's voice came from behind her. He wrapped his arms around her waist, and she leaned back against his chest, watching the sunrise paint their new world. "Scared I'm going to turn your farm into a corporate campus?" she teased. "Nah," he kissed her temple. "The land knows its own, and you proved whose side you're on." Sarah turned in his arms, seeing in his eyes the same love that had grown in her heart during those first simple days of farm work. "Our side," she corrected. "Always our side." Above them, the new sign caught the morning light. Parker Chen Agricultural Innovation Center, where tradition meets tomorrow. It wasn't just a merger of their names, it was a symbol of everything they'd built together. A future where progress didn't mean losing the past, where success was measured in more than dollar signs, and where love could bridge any divide. "Ready to teach these city kids how to milk a cow?" James grinned. Sarah laughed, remembering her own first clumsy attempts. "As long as you're ready to learn about AI crop monitoring." "Deal," he said, and sealed it with a kiss that tasted of morning coffee and endless possibilities. 1 year later, the Parker Chen Agricultural Innovation Center had become a model for sustainable farming education across the country. The old farmhouse kitchen, still the heart of everything, now hosted weekly community dinners where students and farmers shared meals and knowledge. Sarah stood at her favorite spot by the window, watching James demonstrate traditional plowing techniques to a group of eager students. She'd long since mastered the art of balancing conference calls with farm chores, often taking investor meetings while helping with the harvest. Her designer suits now hung alongside overalls in their closet, both equally worn. Margaret had become the center's most beloved instructor, her cooking classes combining old-world wisdom with modern nutrition science. The waiting list for her farm-to-table technology workshop stretched months long. Today, she was teaching a group of tech developers how to understand the rhythm of seasonal growing, knowledge that would help them create better agricultural software. The farm itself had flourished. Solar panels glinted alongside heritage crop fields, while automated irrigation systems worked in harmony with traditional farming methods. The old barn now housed a state-of-the-art computer lab, but still smelled comfortingly of hay and leather. "Mrs. Parker Chen," a student called out, waving from the vegetable garden, "the soil sensors you designed are showing amazing results." Sarah smiled at the hyphenated name she'd taken 6 months ago in a ceremony held right here on the farm. The wedding had made headlines, the billionaire CEO and her farmer husband, but the real story was in the details. The locally grown flowers, the feast prepared by Margaret and her cooking students, the perfect blend of high-tech and homespun. That had become their signature. As she watched James finish his lesson and head toward the house, Sarah rested her hand on her slightly rounded belly. Soon, there would be a new generation to carry on both their legacies, one that would grow, up understanding both the power of innovation and the wisdom of tradition. The autumn colors painted the farm in brilliant hues as the community gathered for the first annual harvest festival. Students and farmers worked side by side, bringing in the last crops of the season. The scent of Margaret's apple pies wafted from the kitchen, mixing with the crisp fall air. Sarah watched from the porch as James drove the combine harvester, now equipped with AI sensors he'd helped design, through the golden wheat fields. Their success story had inspired 5 more innovation centers across the country, each one preserving a family farm while advancing agricultural science. The old oak tree, where they'd shared their first kiss, now shaded a high-tech weather station, a perfect symbol of their harmonious blend of old and new. Tom Thompson's grandchildren were giving drone demonstrations to visiting investors, while their grandfather explained the ancient art of reading weather patterns in the clouds. "Who would have thought," Margaret said, joining Sarah on the porch, "that a broken-down car and a rainy night would lead to all this?" Sarah smiled, touching her growing belly. "Sometimes the best things come from unexpected detours." As the harvest festival wound down, James found Sarah standing by the old farmhouse gate, the same spot where she'd first appeared that rainy night. The setting sun cast long shadows across the land they'd transformed together, yet kept true, and to its roots. "Remember when you thought I was just a stranger who needed help?" Sarah asked, leaning into his embrace. "Turns out you were exactly what this place needed," James replied, his hand gentle on her belly. "A little bit of city, a little bit of country." Margaret called from the porch, "You two better come see this sunset. Some things even technology can't improve on." They walked hand in hand toward home, their footsteps marking a path between past and future. That evening, as stars began to twinkle above the Parker Chen Agricultural Innovation Center, Sarah and James stood together in their favorite spot beneath the old oak tree. The gentle hum of crickets mixed with the distant sound of students' laughter from the barn's new tech lab. "You know," James whispered, "Dad always said true wealth grows from the ground up." Sarah smiled, thinking of how a simple act of kindness had grown into something beyond her billions, something real, lasting, and full of promise. The farm's lights twinkled in the distance, a perfect blend of tradition and progress, just like their love.